Hello, I'm Nick Offerman, white male translator for Gaslit Nation. To sum up this week's episode, kleptocracy anywhere is kleptocracy everywhere.
Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I'm your host, Andrea Chalupa, a writer and the screenwriter and producer of the upcoming journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones.
And I'm Sarah Kenzier, a journalist and researcher on authoritarian states and the author of the book, The View from Flyover Country.
And today we are talking to Olga Lautman, an independent researcher and an expert on the Russian Mafia. Olga did research for Craig Unger's book, House of Trump, House of Putin, The Untold Story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia, as well as Malcolm Nance's forthcoming book, The Plot to Betray America, How Team Trump Embraced Our Enemies, Compromised Our Security, and How We Can Fix It. So Olga is on the show today to tell us how we can fix it. It's all up to you, Olga.
Hi, how are you? Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. So how did you get involved researching these books and just in general studying the Russian crime syndicate that has now infiltrated our government?
Well, I've been following Russian politics and Ukrainian politics my whole life, and I got alarmed in 2015 when I saw Russian media, tilting towards Donald Trump. And I became intrigued because before that, they never really favored a candidate. So I started looking into it to see what is going on, and I kind of fell into the mob world.
Why? Because Donald Trump is the rabbit hole into the mob world?
Well, what happened is that I wanted to see, why would the Kremlin favor Donald Trump? I know from being a New Yorker that, Trump, everyone in New York knows that he was dealing with Italian mafia. So I thought at the beginning when I went into this that maybe the Kremlin has some kind of compromise on him, like with dealings with the Italian mafia. As I started digging into it, I kind of started seeing, all his properties going back almost 4 decades, all his properties being occupied by senior Russian mafia figures, Russian oligarchs, and that's where I kind of fell into it and started trying to unravel the whole thing.
Wow. And so your background as well, you're Ukrainian and Russian, and you grew up in Brighton Beach. Could you speak a little bit about your story? Were you born over there? Were you born here?
I was born in Italy. My parents were on the way here from the Soviet Union. And I was born in Italy, and then we came here when I was 2 months old in the 70s. We basically came with a wave of Soviet immigrants because of the Jackson-Varick Amendment that allowed Russian Jews to come in. And I grew up in Brighton Beach, so I was very familiar with the mob world. And I always followed Russian and Ukrainian politics, and I have family in both countries. And I got along with both sets until Crimea, and then after that I kind of, it became more hostile with the Russian side, and obviously I partnered with the Ukrainian side because, Putin invaded Crimea.
Yeah. And he's the mass murdering thug.
Exactly.
And so obviously with your story, what's so interesting is that when you read Craig Unger's book, Brighton Beach is ground zero for so much of this, even with Donald Trump's own father building sort of slummy buildings there and being all mobbed up himself and getting ensnared in all these scandals. Could you talk about sort of that period in time in Brighton Beach, give us a snapshot of why this neighborhood in Brooklyn was so significant for organized crime, how it came to be, and what it sort of meant for Donald Trump and Fred Trump?
Well, when the Soviets were coming over, especially in New York, they kind of settled in Brighton Beach. It was called Little Odessa. I mean, partly to be familiar with their surroundings, and they kind of set up everything very culturally to how it was back home. At the same time, when the Soviet Union allowed Soviets to come here, they also released a lot of criminals and also spies. So they,
of course, because they were like, "Fuck you, freedom of the West." We're gonna, that's exactly what they did.
So they did that, and pretty much at the beginning, the Soviets were coming in, and it was the same wave. Like I came with the same wave as like Felix Sater's family and the Bogadins and Tamir Sapir and Sam Kislin. So.
And who are all these people? They're mobsters, right?
They ended up being mobsters.
Yeah. But you escaped. You're like a Disney story.
Yeah.
You're like...
I didn't. They ended up being mobsters. But so they allowed a lot of the criminals out. They came here, and they started driving cabs, for a few dollars. And at that time, what happened is they partnered with the Italians.
Right, because the Italian Mafia was
the
ruling.
90s or the 80s?
No, this is the 70s.
Oh, this is the 70s. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm way back.
This is some old school shit. Like half of New York was on fire.
Right.
My mom was in the South Bronx at this time. My dad was in Astoria. So I grew up with a lot of these New York back in the day, war zone kind of stories.
Trump was just starting out with Roy Cohn. All right, we have set the scene. Tell us more, Olga.
So Brighton Beach became and it wasn't only like Brighton Beach. It became known for Russian mafia, but at the same time, the neighborhood over is controlled by this Italian family, and it was everything in Brooklyn was kind of divided, and under control of a certain family. So basically, the Russians partnered with the Italians. And at the same time, Trump's family was with the Italians. And it's even funny because you have even a case, there was a Russian mobster on Brighton who ended up being the second godfather after he had the prior one assassinated.
Wait, who is this?
Murat Balugala.
Oh, okay.
So when he got in trouble, there was a rabbi in Brooklyn, and he went to this rabbi, and the rabbi actually tried to get him a lawyer, and he went to Alan Dershowitz. So this is how far back, and this was like in 1984.
So Dershowitz was already in the mix back then?
But Dershowitz was, I think, a professor at Brooklyn College.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Dershowitz declined, but the fact
that he was even on their radar as a person to go to.
Hey, we know somebody with no scruples.
I know, right? And this rabbi, which is extremely fascinating, his name was Greenwald.
Glenn Greenwald.
No relation to Glenn, I don't think. But his name was Rabbi Greenwald. He was in Brooklyn in the Midwood area. He wasn't just a local rabbi. He became a huge international player. So not only was he tangled up with the Russian mafia, he was also helping this Russian spy who was in Latin America, Kalmanovich. He was helping to have him transferred back. So, and he was close to Kissinger, and it was like this little rabbi from Brooklyn, had a lot of very powerful connections inside the Reagan administration. So.
Huh, that's interesting. It's interesting how Kissinger just keeps appearing in all this. And part of me is like, okay, yes, he's obviously like famous statesman, involved in
war criminal.
Yeah, and war criminal and an old man, so that happens. But
who happened to appear in the Oval Office the day after or something like that? Trump fires Comey. Remember? It was like Comey gets purged, America's gasps, and then suddenly it's like the news cuts to Kissinger, Trump in the Oval Office.
There.
Everyone's like, what is going on?
And then it's Kislyak and Lavrov.
But Kissinger. Okay, so with Kissinger, he's behind national interest with the Russian spy Symes.
Right, Dmitry Symes, right?
Yes. They're the ones who moved the meeting to the Mayflower to make it more intimate.
Right.
So Kissinger was involved before, and for an old man, he had a lot of flyer miles through 2015, 2016, and on. And Kissinger knows Putin since Putin was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. So Kissinger knows Putin for decades. And he went to Russia several times in 2015, 2016. Then the Mayflower event he was involved with. And then when it came to the cabinet picks, he was also showing up in Trump Tower during the transition period to help pick the cabinet. He's the one, I think, who actually picked Tillerson.
That's what I was just wondering about.
And then after that, he again kept making trips back and forth. I think he even has
Back and forth between the U.S. and Russia?
Yeah, he even has an apartment, I think, on the outskirts of Moscow.
So the Tillerson appointment is interesting. Kissinger having a hand in it is certainly interesting. Christopher Steele came out saying that Romney, when he was being considered for Secretary of State, that got nixed by some Kremlin friends of the Trump transition team, saying no way, no to Romney, because Romney may perhaps was slow to get on that Trump train, was very critical of Trump during the election, and even called out Putin in his famous debate with Obama back in 2012, which seemed very retro at the time, as Obama pointed out. But Romney was off, and so Tillerson came in as a much friendlier choice for the Kremlin because they had all that money to make together with Exxon and the Kremlin drilling in the Arctic.
That went on hold because of
the sanctions. So Kissinger coming in to sort of and Kissinger's like friends with Condoleezza Rice, who was like pushing Tillerson.
And
this is what kleptocracy looks like, everyone. It's just profiting and just putting your morals and your patriotism and state sovereignty aside. So I had a meeting back, I want to say early 2015, with a Russian lawyer who is a big civil rights lawyer, Mark Fagan, who represents Pussy Riot and a lot of political prisoners inside Russia. And he was trying to get Nadia Savchenko, the Ukrainian pilot, POW, that the Russians kidnapped, trying to get her freed. So he represents all those sort of civil rights, political prisoner cases in Russia. And so I said to him, I'm like, well, is there anybody in the West that could go over and negotiate directly with Putin? You know, Bill Clinton, I believe, did that with Korea, right? Like he went over to get a journalist out of North Korea. Which Western statesman does Putin respect? And he said Kissinger. Kissinger. And I think it's just because war criminals, it's recognized game.
I don't know, I was always under the impression, because the way the Russian press idolizes Kissinger, that Putin kind of also maybe fears him in the same way as respecting him, because he was way more powerful when Putin was just, a deputy mayor.
Right.
And it's just the way the Russian press, the way they write about him.
This old school respect.
Yeah.
The elder statesman. And, I had, as a young idealistic woman, which now as an old idealistic woman, as a very young little chickadee, I had a vow to myself that as ever at the same party or ever found myself in proximity to Kissinger, I'd pour red wine on him. Naturally, those promises you make in youth.
Yes.
And then I found myself as a reporter at the Google Vanity Fair party covering, I think it was the 2008 presidential convention for the Republicans. And there was Kissinger, a glass of wine in my hand, and I was like, well, Andrea, time to warm it up. Well, I got spared because, could you imagine? I'm like, I don't need a job. Let me just this wine and Kissinger. No, but he was surrounded by the thickest neck white men you could imagine. They were just like groupies. It was Kissinger as like this little dark donut hole in the center of like this massive old-fashioned beige donut of like Republican groupie men, all men with the thickest necks and all suited up. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't even get anywhere near him because he was just holding court. So this was at the Google Vanity Fair party at the Republican convention in St. Paul, Minnesota in 2008. And I was like, okay, well, I guess that spares me that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable because everybody from like the 80s is surfacing back.
Yeah.
All of them, they're all coming back.
But one more thing I want to bring up regarding Kissinger is that so much of this seems to date back to Nixon, who of course was linked with Roy Cohn, and then all of these sort of proteges that came out of there, which includes Kissinger, it includes Dimitri Simes, like it includes, so many individuals, and even includes Hillary Clinton, who was on the opposing council, trying to indict Nixon. And so I feel like
and
we're all
Paul
living in this.
Manafort
And Manafort and
Roger
Stone and,
his tattoo.
yeah, I mean, it's like Nixon's revenge. Like we're in some kind of baby boomer
And they all
nightmare.
traveled. They went from Nixon, then they went into the Reagan administration, then they went into the Bush administration.
Right, and they tried for Dole, and that's
Yeah.
also another shady thing. So I think he's involved in overseas ventures. But for Brighton Beach, you're describing it as these different like crime families, just in New York in general. Like there are Italian crime families and Russian crime families. Then comes Giuliani, who in the 80s gets known as this like super prosecutor, like he's taking down the Italian mafia. Like, what's the deal with Giuliani, and how did that action affect the presence of the Russian mafia in New York?
Well, that is the thing that it took me many decades to realize. So in the 80s, you have the Russian mafia rising. They're splitting. There was the famous deal that they were involved with for several years with the gasoline, skimming the New York state taxes off of the gasoline. And the Russian mafia and the Italian mafia were working together, and slowly the Russians are getting very confident. And at the same time, what's happening back in the Soviet Union, you have now the KGB, because the system is kind of destabilizing even in the earlier to mid 80s. And you have the KGB, who now is looking to move money out. And they start with Russian mobster Boris Berstein, who actually, his son-in-law was Trump's business partner in Trump Toronto. So you have them using someone like him. They send him to Canada. And he opens up a company, a trading company, because they all had trading companies. And the KGB sets up a series, like hundreds of companies across the world, to move money out of the Soviet Union. And I feel the same was happening in New York. They had Sam Kislin, who became partners with Cherny in Russia, who was a very influential at that time. Like he was one of the top influential people in the 80s and early 90s in Russia. So at that time, I think that's what happens. Now they're getting, more confident because they know how our system works. The Italians kind of taught them all the loopholes, and now they kind of decide that the Italians are becoming competition. And then you have Giuliani, who is, the prosecutor of the century, putting away Italian family after Italian family behind bars. But then at the same time, by the early 90s, he becomes associated, even maybe the late 80s, he becomes associated with Sam Kislin. And Sam Kislin, he's, at that time, was a Soviet immigrant, and now, he's from Odessa, I think. He's Ukrainian. And he becomes a very important factor because Sam Kislin was donating a lot of money to Giuliani and to his campaign. And at the same time, Sam Kislin pops up on the FBI's radar because the thief-in-law. So one of the thieves...
Basically the Russian mafia interconnected underground brotherhood of crime.
Yes. So there was a famous thief-in-law who was connected to one of the main leaders of the Russian mafia in the late 80s into early 90s, Semyon Mogilevich. He released this thief-in-law. His name was Ivankov. And Ivankov makes his way to New York, and he knows Kislin, and they end up working together, and at the same time they end up getting a visa, sponsoring a visa to get a contractor to the country, into New York. And from that he pops on the FBI's radar. And Giuliani knew this. And at the same time, the interesting thing with Sam Kislin is that now going back to 1977, when he becomes partners with Tamir Sapir. Trump somehow walks into Kislin, and Tamir Sapir had an electronics store in Manhattan. And they, at that time, it was kind of known that it was like Soviet dignitaries who went to this electronics store. And it was kind of definitely involved like Russian intel collecting and whatnot. So they have this electronics store. Trump walks into this electronics store in 1977 and takes TVs on credit from Sam Kislin for his Commodore Hotel. So this Kislin guy pops up in the 70s into Trump's circle. Then he pops up in the 90s and around Giuliani. And Giuliani ends up putting him on the New York Business Council. And then he spends a decade in Giuliani's circle. Then he's back with Trump when Trump opens Trump UN World Tower. And he's writing out mortgages for Russian oligarchs and also a Ukrainian oligarch who ends up, becoming a leader in the Party of Regents. So this has been continuing on over the decades.
Right.
And you have Felix Sater involved, you have Kislin involved, you have Tamir Sapir. Tamir Sapir ends up partnering with Trump in Trump Soho.
I mean, it just seems like such an ideal situation. It's like Giuliani gets rid of the Italian mafia, so there's no competition. There's a lackey of the of the Russian mafia installed into a business commission as Giuliani becomes the mayor of New York. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union collapses, and so everyone is finally able to get out, move money freely. Everybody is getting into the capitalist glory of the time, and I think a lot of that Russian money-making activity was viewed as, they're just, embracing capitalism and having a difficult go of it. We're just going to let that roll. I mean, it's just in retrospect, a lot of this seems extremely sketchy at the time. Maybe we were young then, so I was a kid, so I don't know. But I guess one of the things I'm wondering is then you get to the question okay, well, where was New York law enforcement? Where was, for example, the New York FBI? What was their relationship to this rising mafia syndicate? Hear me out. You walk into a store and you immediately find exactly what you're looking for. You try it on and it looks perfect. Well, that's basically the feeling you get every time you shop at Movement Watches. That's MVMT Watches. Our friends at Movement have you covered with tons of quality, clean, and all-around good-looking watches and accessories that we can actually afford and order right from our couch. They're one of the fastest growing watch companies in the world because of their iconic minimalist designs. They believe that no one should have to overpay for great style, so they're always coming out with new, fashion-forward designs for you. They also have sunglasses and a growing jewelry collection, so they've got all your accessory needs covered. Movement offers a diverse set of products that make great gifts for a friend or for yourself. Movement watches start at just $95, so you're guaranteed to find something you love that won't break your bank. Get 15% off today with free shipping and free returns by going to movement.com/gaslit. See why Movement keeps growing. Check out their expanding collection. Go to mvmt.com/gaslit. Join the movement.
That I had the same question, and apparently they didn't see the Russian mafia as a threat. That's the answer that I got. They didn't see it as a threat, despite, besides the fact of everything, them becoming a national security risk because of, the dealings back and forth between the Soviet Union and then after it collapses, the Russia and here. So they didn't see it as a threat, so they didn't have Russian speakers to kind of infiltrate it. Now, if you lived on Brighton Beach at the time, every other store was a brothel. And it was, and
this is in the 90s, you mean?
In the 80s
90s?
And 90s. 90s, it got even worse. And it was really sad because at the same time, they were trafficking girls in. They would put ads in, papers in Russia. Oh, we're looking for a nanny. We're looking for housekeeping. The minute these girls come here, they confiscate their papers and tell the girls, if you open your mouth, then we will kill your family back home. And it was really sad. And the local police department got it because, they started, I think they spent the whole day, every single day, going after these prostitution places. But it took quite a while And at the same time, like eventually Brighton Beach became, the wiretap because they were involved in everything. I mean, if there was a way to scheme the government or to scheme financial institutions or anything, they found it. Whether it be setting up medical centers, whether it be setting up car accidents and then scheming the insurance companies, the gasoline scheme, everything. Like anything they could do, food stamps.
And that was kind of like on the local level, like low level guys. But at the top with like Mogilevich and stuff, there was more like, I mean, from what I've read, like sex trafficking, drug trafficking, nuke trafficking, intelligence trafficking.
Well, perfect example. Trump sold condos in 1984, which was probably the first money laundering deal, to David Bogatin. David Bogatin ends up later on, his brother ends up working for Mogilevich in the 90s and becomes like a very important partner in Pennsylvania for him with the YBM magnates.
I'm just going to briefly, Bogatin is the first Russian mobster to move into Trump Tower, right? In like 1984.
He bought like 5 apartments.
5 apartments.
Right, so sort of
cash.
the beginning of like an official record of a Trump property with Russian mafia involved.
The beginning of a beautiful friendship.
And he came in 77 or 78 with like $2 in his pocket. So, and he bought 5 apartments for cash.
He did. Of course he did.
So anyway, with him, he ended up because finally he fell on the radar of law enforcement here. So he left and he went to Poland. He had like a Polish Italian partner who was handling also a mobster and handling organized crime there. He was shipping heroin into New York. I mean, and he was probably one of the biggest heroin traffickers. And the heroin was coming into Staten Island, into Brooklyn. So that just shows you that even though it looked localized, they were all involved, whether it be in Panama, whether it be in Sierra Leone, whether it be in Israel.
It was like globalized crime.
Yeah.
It was the era of globalization, crime. Like I was reading an old speech. It was Bill Clinton in 1995. He spoke at the UN and was saying organized crime is a threat, and mostly emphasizing Latin America. But he talked, I think, briefly about the Russian mafia, and it reminded me of Obama gives this warning in 2011 about organized crime as a national threat. And of course, Mueller made his famous speech, but no one really seems to act on this threat. And at the same time, another interesting thing is if we look at who was in charge in the national level of the FBI in the 90s, we have William Sessions. And then after that, I think Louis Freeh. They both warned quite a bit about the dangers of the Russian mafia and its power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then went on to work for
them.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, with William Sessions, after he was dismissed by Bill Clinton, he ended up representing Mogilevich, and Mogilevich was one of the top 10 on the FBI list.
Do we know why he did that? Like, you would think he could get other job opportunities. Like, why would you go work for the head of the Russian mafia if you were the former director of the FBI?
I just think that the corruption was... it just seems the more you look into it that the corruption, it kind of goes into the 70s after the Nixon administration. And I think that we never actually dealt with the corruption. And for instance, I had spoken with Oleg Kalugin, who used to be head of counterintel for KGB, and he said that America was his best client. He said that he used to come in, nonetheless, to Brighton Beach, but he used to come in the 60s and 70s. He came here as a student, and then I think to Columbia Journalism School, and then as a journalist, those were his covers. And he said America was one of my top clients. And he traveled. I mean, he recruited spies everywhere in the Middle East. He went on several countries he was in charge of. But he said that America was the best. He's like, well, you had people in the State Department and the CIA and
By people, what does he mean? Like informants or
informants for the KGB.
Wow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he said he used to walk on Brighton Beach and recruit people, and then famously, meet with them in one of the Russian restaurants. And, to kind of get information. He had people in New York City. So I think the Russians, obviously, since the 50s, they have been trying to infiltrate. And the problem is that they are experts at collecting blackmail.
Right.
And it's like one wrong thing you do, then they will use that. And it starts off simple. So they'll start off with something, like a small favor, like, oh, can you just deliver me these files that you don't think anything of, or these papers, or this article. And then it kind of builds and builds and builds. And then once you cross that line, then you kind of suddenly, when you want to back out and say, I can't, oh no, now you work for us. So you can't really get out. And I think that's what was happening. And perfect example, when I went to look for, because Trump's first wife was Czechoslovakian, I went to see if there were any Czechoslovakian spies in New York. Mm-hmm. Perfect example, I find this Czech spy, Karl Kosher, and at the time, Karl Kosher was reporting to the Czech agency, and they were reporting back to the KGB because it was a satellite.
Right.
But then eventually he had a fight with STB. He had a fight with that agency and started directly working for the Kremlin, for KGB. Mm-hmm. So he works for KGB. He ends up becoming one of the biggest CIA moles. And you know what he did? He would go to a sex orgy place in Manhattan and find his fellow agents, who was doing what. It was, and he would report that information back to the KGB.
Good Lord.
And supposedly Bolton was involved with that.
Oh, really?
And that's in the 70s. Because apparently what happened...
Ew. Sorry, gut reaction.
John Bolton?
Yes.
How was he involved?
Because
mustaches were the thing in the 70s.
Yeah, no, he used to attend Plato's Retreat, and apparently when his wife, he was out of the country in the early 80s, his wife, when she left, she,
Can you imagine the poor woman? I just want to say, like...
Plato's Retreat, the swingers club?
Yes.
Wait, he was into that? John
Yes.
Bolton?
He was swinging.
Is that...
All of them were, I think.
Is that...
I've heard about this, too.
Roger Stone advertised, he and his wife advertised
Yeah.
to do some swinging, and Manafort, of course, had those texts released about
God.
his own...
If this all gets out, it's going to be... No, nothing.
Yeah, when his wife...
We're in some nasty viewing.
When he was out of the country, his wife fled and filed for divorce. And in the divorce papers, she said that he used to take her to Plato's Retreat. When I read them, I'm like, wait, Karl Kosher used to go to Plato's Retreat. And
That's why I will never go to a sex party.
Yeah.
Because you never know who you're fucking. It could be John Bolton.
Oh, God. Ugh. Sorry. That was
No, so here, listen to how
I need
even
a shower.
weirder this gets. So this Karl Kosher is operating in New York. He ends up being caught as a mole in the CIA. Guess who's prosecuting his case? Giuliani.
That was going to be my guess.
And he screws up the case, and he ends up being exchanged in a spy swap, and that's it. And off he went.
Good God. I have to ask you about Felix Sater, because he, of course, exemplifies so much of this. Like, he, came from a Russian mafia family from the former Soviet Union, then fled to Israel, then came to here when he was, I think, pretty small, right? Like, he was a child.
Yeah.
Grew up in Brighton Beach, and then, became a Wall Street dude, became a gangster, was a gangster, and then became an FBI informant. And, we have asked so many people about this, and no one seems to have an answer of like, okay, so Trump is running for president. You already know Trump.
Book series is for Sarah and
Trump
I.
is just like sketchy, anyway. Like, you don't even need to do the Russia stuff. You could just look at his zillion bankruptcies, his shady ties, all this stuff. But, if you want a direct connection between Trump and the Russian mafia, you have Felix Sater, who of course worked for Trump, worked for the Russian mafia, also worked for the FBI. Therefore, you kind of think the FBI knew about Trump. So
And if you want to hear even of a weirder coincidence, Felix Sater, so here's Trump Tower. You have a building behind on Madison Avenue. Trump Tower is on Fifth Avenue. And there's an atrium that connects the building on Madison Avenue to Trump Tower. And it goes into the lobby of Trump Tower. So this building, Felix Sater, I mean, I don't know if it was like, like where you rent just the address and you're physically not there, but both Felix Sater and Carter Page had companies on the
Carter
same
Page
floor.
was there too. Okay,
On the
great.
21st floor, the same floor.
Right.
For years.
I mean, and then also,
I'm not kidding, like
just
a decade.
To add to that, you also had Sater, of course, is childhood best friends with Michael Cohen,
Yes.
who is Trump's lawyer. So you have like a zillion connections. Then you could throw in Manafort, then you could throw in Stone.
Well, even with Manafort had a partner who was involved also with Mogilevich and in the lawsuit that was filed by Yulia Tymoshenko in New York that was dismissed. So she filed a lawsuit against Mogilevich, Manafort, and a guy, Brad Zaxxon. Brad Zaxxon was Fred Trump's protege in the 70s and the 80s. Brad Zaxxon went to jail. He came out of jail. Fred Trump took him under the wing and kind of, taught him all the ropes. He ends up becoming partners with Manafort with Firtash, with this
Right.
hotel, and he ends up becoming partners and lands in this lawsuit of like the mafia.
Well, just
of the
briefly
mafia.
explain it. Firtash is a Russian oligarch Ukrainian mobster oligarch who is represented by Lanny Davis, the lawyer, who is also representing Michael Cohen.
Yes.
Because everyone has to be connected. This is like
Yes.
this, I don't even know. But my question is, it's like, okay, so you're like in, intelligence or law enforcement.
How
and
did you
it's-
miss all of this?
Yeah, it's 2015, and you know that Trump is going to be, or 2016, Trump's going to be the candidate at the least, may well ascend to the presidency.
Well, why did he even become a candidate? Why wasn't he prosecuted decades ago?
I mean, all these dudes should have been in jail like decades ago. But I keep thinking at some point, Trump was getting intelligence briefings. Like, how could they possibly give this guy
I
intelligence
don't
briefings
know.
with his
with
connections?
Manafort living downstairs because Manafort
Right.
lived for a decade.
With like a dormitory of mobsters, and they're just
Yes.
going to go in and give them the most classified information. Like,
he had at one point, and I'm not kidding, at one point in his Trump Tower, which I call the Kremlin Mob Tower, he had Chuck Blazer running the FIFA scandal for Putin. And Chuck Blazer was very close to Putin. He was very close with Trump. They were very good friends. He had Bayrock with Felix Sater and Tamir Sapir running out of the building during the same years. And he had a huge international money laundering operation running out of the building with this guy, Taiwan chick, his name is Dr. Honov, who ends up being on Trump's red carpet.
this is
in-
John Taktakhanov, right?
yeah. He ends up being on the red carpet at Trump's Miss Universe event in 2013, literally a year after his whole crew just got taken out of Trump Tower for money laundering and gambling.
What's significant about the Miss Universe pageant, Trump bringing it to Moscow in 2013, at that same exact time, Putin has just signed the anti-gay laws to try to scapegoat gay men and women inside Russia to sort of build up his fake family values campaign to the classic scapegoating that the far right likes to do. And of course, that was horrendous. And so many on the world stage were boycotting Russia, were speaking out against this, except for Donald Trump. Donald Trump instead shows up to Moscow with his monopoly man persona of being a successful businessman in the West, which is all just marketing, as we know, and it helps legitimize him because mainstream America wasn't on to Trump at that point. He had like a cameo in Home Alone. He was like, he had all this gold around him. His
Few
Well,
cameos.
he was
on
thought
Russia.
of as a joke, and that's actually, I think, the most dangerous thing of all is people, he was the apprentice guy, and he was thought of as just like a giant jackass or a sort of regular mainstream celebrity, neither of which is
He was a
vaguely
caricature.
threatening.
He
Yes,
was a
exactly.
caricature. He was just another mascot in New York City.
And that's what I don't understand, because when I first started looking into this, I mean, it blew my mind. All the classic examples of someone becoming a Russian asset were there. He gets involved with the mafia in the late 70s, with the Russian mafia, Soviet mafia, in the late 70s, 80s. He goes to Soviet Union in 1987. He comes back and starts bashing American foreign policy. Roger Stone is pushing him to run for president. Then he goes back to the Soviet Union in the 90s. He wants to build this Trump Tower, which I personally don't think there ever was a Trump Tower.
No, I don't think so either.
I think it was just cover to move money and also to take the trips. But you see him developing. I mean, in the 80s, he was so obsessed with the Soviet Union that he asked for a Russian post. Like, who wanted to go and become ambassador of something in the Soviet Union?
Right.
He was so upset with Gorbachev that he tracked down an American doctor who had come back from overseas, who was Gorbachev's doctor, brought him over from, I think, Boston, brought him over, arranged a meeting in Trump Tower to find everything out about Gorbachev. Why?
And didn't he try to meet with Gorbachev, but was fooled by some sort of doppelganger or something? There's a story in Spy or one of the older publications.
Eventually he did. And the strangest part is, so you have him starting like legitimately with the Russian Mafia in the 80s, around 84. And around 1986, you have the Soviet ambassador's daughter. She goes, picks up her father, who just landed. He was either the Soviet ambassador to U.S. or to U.S.
Is this Dubinin?
Yeah, Dubinin. And she picks him up and she's like, oh, Dad, let's go to Trump Tower. And she drives him to Trump Tower and they go to have lunch. And that was their first encounter. And now at the same time, the Russian intel services are, they're having difficulties with recruiting people. So they're trying to develop new methods. And obviously money, sex, work. So they find out that, sweetening the pot for Americans will kind of recruit them. Using sex as a weapon will recruit them. I mean, KGB had a whole, unit where they trained women to have sex and collect compromised men.
They trained women to have sex with disgusting men like Trump.
And then he goes to Soviet Union in 87. I mean, gets high-level meetings. How did our intel agencies not flag that?
I don't know. I discovered all this like during the campaign because all I was doing was reading, like people were like, where did you get this information? Journalists would ask me this. I'm like, I got it from your publications back when you reported on things. It was all there. It was in Vanity Fair, New York, Spy, all of Wayne Barrett's work, David K. Johnston's work. Like that's what's mind boggling to me. Because I'm like, if there's this much incriminating information that all you have to do is kind of put it together in public, what did the IC do? What were they, the intelligence community, what were they doing with all of their extra resources besides joining the Russian Mafia after they retire? I mean,
and that's what I don't, and that's what people fail to grasp, because Americans think of the Russian Mafia as like the Italian Mafia.
Right, like all tough guys in tracksuits and stuff.
And that they kind of do their corrupt things and, make their money, and that's it. The Russian Mafia is the Russian government.
Right.
Like there is really
Russian business.
Yes, there is a very thin line between Russian oligarchs, Russian government, and the Russian Mafia. The Russian intel services use Russian Mafia to do things that they don't want their fingerprints on, so they can, deny it. So that's what Americans don't understand. So here, when you're dealing with a senior level Russian mobster, or he's living in Trump's case, he had so many of them living in all his properties, everything is going back to Russian intel. And they are devising a file, and they know the weaknesses, and they know what works, what doesn't work. So that's the big difference, whereas here with the Italian Mafia, if they're dealing with somebody, they, you don't have to worry that they're going to they might blackmail you for personal gain, but not for, to
state gain or something like that. Yeah, it's frightening. And I think it went less detected because like plutocratic Americans or Americans that were high up in the espionage services, but maybe, or in law enforcement, people like Sessions, Lewis Free, but lacked moral fiber. Maybe they just saw a version of themselves, over in the former Soviet USSR.
They went that way.
They're like us. They wish suit and ties. They like expensive things. They are part of a globalized new economy of, kind of, we don't need states. The history has ended. Like, I sometimes see this sort of glorification of the post-Soviet era where Americans felt so triumphant and these oligarchs felt so empowered. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking out loud about how this has brought down the world that, we have to raise our children in, and we have to inhabit.
In plain sight.
In plain sight, yeah. That's actually the title of my new book is Hiding in Plain Sight, because it all happened like right there. I mean, it's a sad thing when you can write about an espionage story using back issues of like Spy. You know what I mean? That's not how life should go.
And that's the thing that people also fail to grasp, that the Russian intel, agents, they studied us. And this is going back to the 50s. They studied us. They studied every loophole, every financial loophole. I mean, in the 80s, they were opening up shell companies and moving money around. Then they got into, using Citibank, and all the big, like Felix Sater worked, for Wall Street. So they found a way to make money off of Wall Street by finding the loopholes.
Right.
They found the loopholes in the banking sector. They found loopholes everywhere. And at the same time, they also found divisions.
Right.
And they kind of collected all this information, made their money, but on top of, and that's actually adding salt to the injury, that on top of making moving around billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars over the past several decades, they kind of collected all this information to devise this grand plot.
Right. I mean, that's what it seems like. I think everyone we've talked to, we're all kind of reevaluating like who won the Cold War and what was the point of, the USSR ending. It just seems like it was, on one sense you have internal factors, you have Chernobyl, you have the war in Afghanistan, you have a collapsing economy, all these things that really did contribute to the collapse. But you also have a lot of very ambitious mobsters, people like Mogilevich who are like, oh, well, this is ideal for me. Like, I no longer have to go procure an Israeli visa to go travel. I can just take off. And all of these, the aluminum magnates, all these guys saw a very advantageous situation. And
if you think, with Deripaska. I mean, Deripaska started under Cherny.
Right.
And Cherny
it's
was
rational.
One of the top, Russian, probably he was one of the most influential at the time after the Soviet Union collapse. And I mean, everyone knew he was Russian mobster.
Right.
And he took what's his name, Deripaska, under his wing and kind of helped him. And Deripaska himself said that he had to kind of fight through the aluminum wars to, get to where he is.
Right. And it's weird to me that people look at this and they're like, what a big mystery. I can't believe they acted this way. It's like, well, they want money and power. It's like literally the same things that
and
every
revenge.
bad guy of every country wants.
Revenge.
And revenge. That's true.
They want revenge because the Soviet, especially the hardliners, they will never forget the West and America and the West for collapsing the country. They feel that it was the West and particularly the United States who are responsible for the collapse. And hence you have people like Putin, who is rising through the KGB ranks, and he's in Dresden, comes back, works in St. Petersburg, and he has this Soviet, it's this hatred towards the West for what they are doing to his country. Because don't forget, at the same time, you have, the whole population was indoctrinated. You are brainwashed there. Throughout, the whole Soviet Union existence, you are brainwashed of what you have to believe, what you have to say, how you have to say it, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. And here, when you see everything kind of collapsing around you, you start having this resentment.
Right.
So for the West, yes, the Cold War ended. For the hardliners and the people who were kind of left, in the wings, it never did.
Well, yeah, it's a complete disruption of your life. Like when I would meet people from Uzbekistan, even if they were glad for independence, they still, older generations, had nostalgia for that time because it was a predictability, and the time in the immediate aftermath was deeply traumatic. I mean, and I think as Americans, we're sort of getting a sense of what is that instability like? Like, what would it be like if America fragmented? What would it be like if, Calexit and Texit actually happened and we lost our states? I think that you're right, that they do do want us to feel that and possibly have that loss. I think with Trump, we see them wanting to just strip the country down to parts.
Absolutely. That's why they were finding
Putin is
exit.
the buyer. All of these international, big shots are the buyers.
And everyone surrounding Putin are his inner circle, and they have the same mentality. They don't have the mentality, let's work with the West. They have the mentality, let's destroy the West. And the quicker we can destroy the West and humiliate the West, the better we will be. Even if it produces zero, it's more of that revenge. Even if there's no money gain, even if they lose money, it's the point. I mean, there's nothing more.
It's the winning.
Yeah, there's nothing more. There's no more joy for them than to see, for instance, a Russian ship today trying to hit a U.S. Navy ship.
Right.
And then having the U.S. president with his hands tied who can't even make a statement.
Right.
For them, it is everything.
And it's interesting because their mechanism of doing this, I mean, they seem to have infiltrated, all sorts of
everything.
Groups. Yeah, intelligence agencies, the NRA, but their primary vehicle seems to be the GOP, which of course they were the Cold Warriors. It was Reagan who brought down the collapse of communism, brought down the USSR. What do you make of that was the party that ultimately led them to triumph in this plot?
It's Animal Farm. It's literally the plot of Animal Farm.
I actually told my mom this. I think what it is that the Republicans are just, they're white men. and they think alike, and they, it's harder
There's the
to
conformity.
It's harder to infiltrate, for instance, Democrats, where you have, representatives who are African American, representatives who are Latin American, representatives who are Russian, who are Americans, Irish, women, old, young. It's harder to kind of get everyone on the same page. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the Republican Party and even the people involved, you can't tell the difference between a Lindsey Graham and a McConnell, and
they're the hollow men.
Yeah,
they're the men circling Kissinger like groupies. That's exactly what.
They also had those cliques, I feel like, because they come from that Trent Lott party, and I feel
the good old boys club, as we say. So I interned on Capitol Hill for Senator Barbara Boxer, very progressive little Jewish woman from New York City. Mm-hmm. And you would see through the summer months on Thursdays, all these Republican members of Congress wearing seersucker suits, like Colonel Sanders suits, basically. And it was a boys club. Yeah. It was like my male colleague interns that summer. They would get invited by a member of Congress to sit down in the cafeteria, hey, Sonny, why don't you sit down, have lunch with me? Do you think they would ever say that to me as a female intern? No.
Nope. And that's what it is. And I feel, and also they have that greed and that power. And
women are objects.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, honestly, the way you were describing Putin's idea of revenge on the West reminds me so much of the GOP idea of, revenge, or just sort of wanting to stamp down, liberals or the left, where there's no actual gain necessarily. Yeah. It's just, I am going to push you down.
Democracy. I don't think the Republicans, I think something happened, because they were never like that. And I can tell you, half Russian, Ukrainian, and if anything, I always looked more prior to Trump to the Republican Party to kind of help Ukraine. Right. Because the Democrats are in La La Land.
Yeah, no, some of my relatives too. Because of Eastern Europe, because they were the ones who were going to bring freedom to Eastern Europe.
And Democrats were more, they were always more the domestic party. They worried about the domestic issues, whereas the Republicans always, were involved in international affairs. They were always hawkish against Russia, or so I thought they were. We looked to them to help us with this. And then after Trump, I couldn't believe it. And Romney is a perfect example. Romney predicted everything that is happening. He warned America. He's like, we are going to be attacked. We need to, kind of push back Putin. And no one listened to him.
Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa and Sarah Kenzier. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It helps keep us going. Our editor for this was Carlin Daigle. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our phenomenal logo was designed by the genius that is Hamish Smith at the New York-based design firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Solomon Hikes, Alan Liu, David Porter, Joel Newman, Paige Harrington, Adam Levine, Alexandria Lane Detweiler, Glenda de Guzman, Henri Deschamps, Jared Lombardo, Jody DeWitt, John Ripley, Kate Cotton, Kelly Ranson, Kevin M. Garnett, Lorraine W. Todd, Tanya Chalupa, Terry Brady, Zachary Lemon, Ann Marshall, Michael Bayland, Brian DeHuden, Carolyn Friend, Catherine Anderson Karina, Kathy Kavanaugh, Diana Gallagher, D.L. Singfield, Doug Friedenberg, Eric Kaplan, Irina Guardia, Ethan Mann, George Hughes, Gordon Shumway, Gustav Halsby, James Tolley, Jason Rita, Jennifer Slavic, Jans Alstra Rasmussen, John Dambro, John Keene, Kenshiro Nakagawa, Kevin Christie, Kim Mellon, Christy Vital, Larry Colwell, Lawrence Graham, Luke Strunted, Margaret Moe, Matt Perez, Matthew Copeland, Maureen Murphy, Michelle Dash, Mike Tripico, Nicole Spear, Rhonda White, Rich Craw, Sonia Bogdanovic, Ted Gary Mitchell, Thomas Burns, Victoria Olson, and Zap Rousdower. Thank you all so much. We could not produce the show without you.